Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for making it tonight, despite some confusion about whether it was live or not, those who come along, and thank you everybody for coming on Zoom. Just to say that this is our last live class, but we are carrying on Tuesday Zooms right into June. We've got another 5 beautiful talks coming up, so please do try to join us again next week. I'll give you more details of that later. Tonight, it's my great pleasure to welcome Peter Sutoris, who is an anthropologist, environmental anthropologist for himself at York University, affiliated York University. And he's author of Educating for the Anthropocene. I'm holding it the right way around, yes. And he's going to be telling us about, well, the field work and the ideas in that book. So I'm going to hand over straight away to Peter. He's got a lot of technical wizardry here, including videos on the computer and slides on there. So we hope it will all work out.
Thank you so much for that introduction. So I am going to start with a video, which is a 2-minute animation that's a summary of the book. So if afterwards I manage to make you fall asleep, at least you will have gotten sort of the basic gist of what the book is about. So I will expand on this, but just to begin with, to give you a summary, let me show this to you.
We are living in the Anthropocene, but what does that mean? It means we are in an age of unspeakable violence against our planet. 66 million years ago, an asteroid collided with Earth. It caused the extinction of the dinosaurs and started a new era, the Paleocene. Today, humans have started another era, the Anthropocene. This time, we are the asteroid. Our disregard for nature has unleashed an environmental multi-crisis, a nightmare combination of linked emergencies from climate change to mass extinction. My book, Educating for the Anthropocene, asks how education might help us prepare for life in this era. Answering this question led me to Pashulok in India and Wentworth in South Africa. Going to these places felt like stepping into a time machine, a glimpse of what the future might soon look like for the entire world. The huge dams and smokestacks around me made it clear that the face of the earth is now the face of man. But the young people in India and South Africa also showed me just how powerful environmental activism can be. Listening to young people and activists in Pashulok and Wentworth helped me see that to tackle environmental destruction, we must rethink education. They taught me that progress starts with grasping what's at stake. This helps us care deeply about the future. Once we care, we can imagine something better. Holding this vision, we can communicate it to others. And when we come together in action, a better future can become a reality. Education has the power to transform the Anthropocene. But instead of obsessing over growing the economy, it must help young people grasp and confront the crises in our culture and politics that are behind the destruction of our planet. We must recognize activists as educators and teachers as activists. This shift is critical. The time to imagine a better future is now. Find out more by reading Educating for the Anthropocene.
And I should mention that this link down here takes you to an open access version of the book. So you don't have to buy it. It's freely available for anybody. So yeah, that's the link, mitpress.mit.edu /educating Anthropocene. That gives you the open access version. Okay, right. So that was the summary. Now I need to switch to the slides.
Yeah. Here and here. Now we share slides.
Sorry.
Down here. Yeah, so we should do. And this is that your top slide, Peter? So let's go up to the top. Whoops. Right,
Okay.
is that
That's
it?
Yeah.
And You can just do it. And I think you can just move that
Yep.
by moving down.
Okay.
I think
Yeah, that works. Right. Okay. So let me tell you more. Obviously, that was just the overview, but to give you a better sense of where this research came from and how I arrived at those arguments, I'm gonna just walk you.
in the box so that
I'm just
you
gonna
see
walk you through the research behind this. These are just some of the kind of framing quotes and some of the ideas that I use in the book, and hopefully they will it will become clearer how all of these ideas relate to this idea of educating for the Anthropocene. So we will be revisiting this. But first, if you'll indulge me, I would actually like to start by saying a few words about my first book, because really the work in this new project is very much an extension of this book, which came out 8 years ago now, and which was on the surface, looking at a very different topic. It was looking at India in the 1950s and the 1960s, and trying to understand the kind of imagination of the future and imagination of development and progress that the Indian independent government, after becoming independent from Britain, was taking. And it was doing that by looking at documentary films. There was this organization that was created by the Indian government right after independence, which basically had the job of informing the country of the kind of future that the government was trying to build. It was essentially a kind of propaganda machine, which created something like 7,000 short films over 30 years, dubbed into 20 different languages, screened all over the country compulsorily in cinemas. And I was interested in understanding, what do these films tell us about how the sort of ruling elites, quote unquote, of the country were imagining the future. And I'd like to play you just a couple of minutes of one of those films, just to give you a taste of what that was about. So for that, I have to switch back to this computer. Okay, so this is called Our Industrial Age.
India has been living in villages for centuries, villages which were once more or less self-sufficient economic units. The village had its potter, its blacksmith, its carpenter, its tanner, and its oil press. There were simple devices for crushing sugarcane and making wood. And the village handloom produced the cloth that was needed. But gradually, as population increased, big cities grew up. They gave an impetus to trade and commerce. This, in turn, led to a rise in the living standards of our people. And the demand for the products of the industrial age also increased. To meet these ever-increasing needs of the people, the production of goods on a mass scale was necessary. For instance, millions of yards of cloth were needed at prices low enough for the average budget. Fans, radios, and other things of daily use came within the reach of many. But this was not enough. Production had to be increased many-fold. And therefore, our country launched the first 5-year plan, committed to increase our agricultural and industrial wealth. To achieve this, the irrigation of thousands of acres of arid land was necessary. The water would also help to turn the turbines to produce more electric power. The construction of dams in different parts of the country received special emphasis under the plan, an inspiring effort to utilize the tremendous water wealth of our subcontinent. Industries like the fertilizer factory at Sindri were set up to support and sustain the program of agricultural development.
get the idea. So I'm going to switch back.
The laptop.
Yeah. Great. Okay, we're back. Excellent. Okay, so why was I showing you that? Well, my argument based on looking at a few hundred of those films was that what they reflected was a kind of polarization, where you've got a group of people that are basically deciding, that India is going to take the path of the sort of Western so-called developed countries. It's going to emulate kind of large-scale infrastructural, industrial progress, which was very much at odds with ideas of, say, Gandhi, who was not at all interested in emulating the Western development trajectory. And these films then become a tool for these elites to basically convince everybody else that this is the right way to go. The people who were making these films came from a fairly narrow demographic. They tended to be living in big cities. They tended to be Western educated men, sort of upper middle class, upper caste. So, very particular demographic with a very particular set of ideas about the future and about what the future ought to become. Telling everybody else, this is what the future is, and you've got to participate. It's the moral thing to do, the ethical thing to do. Now, today we don't have laws that require cinema owners to be showing government films, government propaganda films in cinemas, but we do have education systems that require everybody to go to school. So this new book, Educating for the Anthropocene, really is looking at the same dynamic that I was looking at sort of through a more historical lens in the Indian case, and is looking at that in the present day and thinking about this theme of polarization. Who are the people who are shaping the blueprint for the future, and in what ways does education then kind of pass that blueprint onto others and sort of push others to participate in implementing that blueprint. So that's the kind of central question and sort of central theme. Before I say anything more, I'd like to just address the title. So you might have come across the word Anthropocene. I use it in this book in a particular way, which is not necessarily in the way that it's used here. I mean, this is the geological timescale, the different geological eras. The Anthropocene is the latest era that has been proposed in geology. Many of us would have learned in school science textbooks, would have seen the Holocene as the current era, which was the era that started when the glaciers melted at the end of the last ice age. The idea is that the Anthropocene has now replaced the Holocene, right? The Holocene has ended, the Anthropocene has begun. And the characteristic trait of the Anthropocene, anthropos, human, is that humans are the kind of primary moving force behind environmental change. When you look at the kind of things that happened in the past, when one era ended and another era began, they tended to be large-scale planetary events, like that asteroid that fell 64 million years ago, ended one era, started another. So we have become the asteroid. That's one way of interpreting the Anthropocene thesis or the Anthropocene argument. But I would also like to acknowledge that the Anthropocene is not an unproblematic concept, right? There are problems with this idea, and this is a quote I particularly like that I think really gets at the kind of core issue with this concept. This explanation might be sufficient for polar bears or orangutans seeking to understand what species was disturbing their habitat, right? So what this is getting at is that basically the Anthropocene, the idea of the Anthropocene lumps all people into a single category, a single box, as if we are all equally responsible and also equally affected by this planetary condition, right? So if you were an orangutan or a polar bear, that might be good enough, humans, the species humans is disturbing my habitat. But if you are a social scientist and you're trying to make sense of this, you might need a concept that's maybe a little bit more nuanced. That's why there have been lots of alternatives that have been put forward. There is the Capitalocene, which focuses on capitalism. There is the Anglocene, which focuses on the contributions of the English-speaking world to climate change and other forms of environmental decay. There is the Anthropocene, which focuses on oligarchy. So, there's any number of alternatives. If you look at the literature, there literally are dozens by now. I have chosen to stick with this idea of the Anthropocene. And that's not because I disagree with the criticism. I very much agree with it. But I do think that when we are thinking about something like education, right, which is this sort of universal thing, for better or worse, that affects everybody, at least in Western societies, we expect everybody to go to school. It's important to think about metaphors, concepts, ideas that help us sort of articulate what the shared condition is, right? More kind of looking into the future rather than thinking about the historical responsibility, which is not to say that the historical responsibility isn't important. It is crucially important. But when we're thinking about how we might modify education systems into the future, then I think a concept like the Anthropocene, which is more sort of forward-looking, can be a helpful tool to help us imagine that. And feel free to disagree with me, and hopefully by the end of today's talk, it'll become a bit clearer, why that particular concept might be, why I at least would argue why it is relevant. Okay, so what is this book about? I got this quote, which is a paragraph from the introduction, and it's the only quote I'm gonna read to you, I promise. And it's quite a dense quote, and there's a lot going on in there, so I'm gonna break it down and I'm gonna explain it all. Please bear with me. This book then is an ethnographic exploration of schooling and activism in relationship to slow violence in the context of intergenerational legacies of colonialism, racism, and environmental degradation. What is the relevance of such an exploration to the discussion of education's role in the Anthropocene? In this ethnography, we'll learn about the ways in which state-run schooling seeks to depoliticize the environment, co-opting environmental and sustainability education efforts in service of post-colonial and neoliberal agendas. These ethnographic accounts of schooling cast doubt on the idea that we can educate ourselves out of unsustainability, so long as education means state-sponsored social reproduction. They highlight a contradiction at the heart of global environmental and sustainability education policy. We are, as the British saying goes, putting the cat among the pigeons by trusting political regimes built on environmentally unsustainable ideologies to oversee and finance the effort to bring about sustainability through education. Such political systems have no real incentive to encourage young people to question the regime's fundamental values, such as infinite growth. This volume takes us into activist communities where such values are challenged, illustrating the ways learning for environmental justice and sustainability occurs outside formal education systems. Right, so first of all, I'm talking about slow violence. Slow violence is the title of a book published by the environmental humanities scholar Rob Nixon, which I would highly recommend to anyone interested in this. His argument is that the kind of environmental destruction that we are witnessing tends to unfold very slowly, almost imperceptibly slowly. So it's very difficult for us to grasp it with our senses. Something like climate change, right? You don't necessarily see climate change unfolding in real time until you reach a kind of tipping point when it does, become very sort of viscerally something that you feel in a very visceral way. And that makes slow violence particularly difficult for educators. How do you educate somebody about something that they cannot perceive with their senses? It's what you might call a hard problem, right? A real sort of conundrum. But what I'm also talking about here is that when you're thinking about doing this kind of research and thinking about how we might actually engage with slow violence, one way to do it is to go to places where the slow violence is accelerating, right? So places that are, like I was saying in the animation, like a time machine, right? Places that are maybe a bit further along that trajectory of environmental decay. And so, here in London, we may not be experiencing some of the things that people in the research sites where I did this work are already experiencing. And if we go to places where these things are already happening, so the slow violence is already turning into fast violence, there's something we can learn by looking at how people in these spaces are engaging with that condition, how are they responding, and also how are they learning about it, right? What kind of environmental learning, takes place in a space of accelerating violence, accelerating slow violence? That's a kind of central question that this project is asking. The other part of it is also thinking about what we actually mean by education, right? So here I'm talking about how there's this paradox, right? That we are somehow expecting that education systems run by governments are going to help us educate ourselves out of the mess that we are in, right? That somehow we'll be able to educate young people, future generations, in ways that will make them live differently, behave differently, and that's going to be somehow part of the solution to the problem. When you look at a lot of sort of environmental education policy documents, that's the kind of argument, that's the kind of assumption that you see. What I'm suggesting here is that actually what this fieldwork taught me is that that's not at all necessarily the case, right? That the governments who are themselves perpetuating or enabling that slow violence, or even the acceleration of that slow violence, don't necessarily have an incentive to then go and sensitize young people and equip them with tools that would make them critical of the choices that these regimes are making. So we've got another kind of conundrum here, right? Where we are somehow hoping that the governments are going to do this, but then why would they be doing it, right? Given that they themselves are failing to address the issue in the first place. And therefore, we need to look into alternative spaces. We need to think about education more broadly than simply just schooling and formal education systems. And that's where the activism component comes in. Again, when you go in, you go into places of accelerating slow violence, right? Spaces of accelerated time. These two research sites that I'm about to tell you more about. What you'll find is that there's a lot of environmental activism, unsurprisingly, that people are, picking up these fights. They're really resisting what's going on, and that becomes a form of education, an alternative space of education in itself. And that's another sort of central argument of the book. And that in some ways, actually, this idea of educating for the Anthropocene, right? Educating somebody in a way that is responsive to the historical moment and the planetary condition that we are in, might actually be more effective through these alternative non-formal spaces, such as activism, than the formal school systems. So that's another sort of implication of what I'm saying. Okay, so let me take you to these places. Pashulok is a rehabilitation site for some of the people who were forcibly displaced by the Indian government about 15, 20 years ago, when Tehri Dam, which is what you're looking at, was built, which is one of the largest dams built in India, in the northern state of Uttarakhand, in the foothills of the Himalayas, and which has displaced about 100,000 people. A hugely controversial project, not just because of the displacement, but also because it's built on the Ganges, which of course has a huge religious significance, and also because it's built on a geological fault line. So scientists have done modeling that shows that if there were to be an earthquake of a certain magnitude, and if the dam were to be breached, could be looking at tens of thousands of casualties pretty much instantly downstream from the dam. So very, very controversial on many, many grounds. But what I was interested in was, how does the condition of being resettled in this way, how does that affect the life of the people? So this is one of the streets in Pashulok, and you can see people have built houses, but when they were initially moved here, they were just given plots of land with no infrastructure, no streets, no electricity, no sewage, no water. The school where I did my field work is actually squatting to this day inside an abandoned shopping complex, which is what you're looking at here, because no school building was provided by the state. So this also gets at this idea of the environmental multi-crisis, which you heard in the animation in the beginning. I very purposely don't use the expression climate change in this book, because climate change is just one element of the crisis, right? There's a wider set of what I would argue are more fundamental issues that have to do with the culture and the politics of how we relate to the natural environment and to each other. And I think you can really see that kind of intersection, in a place like Pashulok, where it's not just about this initial act of violence of, forcibly moving 100,000 people, but then also how that then interacts with these pre-existing patterns of exclusion and inequality. Right, South Africa. You're looking at a view from school corridor in the South African school where I did my field work. This is in the township of Wentworth in South Durban, which has a very particular history. It is one of the most environmentally polluted, one of the most industrially polluted places on Earth, with sky-high levels of pollutants in the air, skyrocketing cases of thyroid cancer, other types of cancers, lots of respiratory conditions. In the school where I worked, about 60% of kids were carrying asthma pumps, which, if you go to the other side of the city, just over the hill, about 5 kilometers north, drops down to about 3%. So clearly huge impact on the health of the populations. It's got a very particular history that some historians actually argue is at the very heart of the entire sort of apartheid, the sort of development of apartheid as a regime. South Durban is home to the largest port in all of Africa, with tons of international shipping, which goes back to the 19th century. And over time, what's happened is that industries have been built around this port, and particularly sort of late 19th, early 20th century, the industries were particularly dirty and polluting with terrible working conditions. In some ways, that's still the case. And so what you needed as a state was basically, labor, disposable labor, people whose health and life, frankly, you didn't care about. And so there was again a lot of forced displacement, a lot of moving of people of color to the vicinity of these industries. And so some historians that have sort of tracked the development of apartheid actually argued that this is a kind of early blueprint for the kind of city planning, the kind of segregation of cities by race that then becomes codified after World War II with the kind of formalization of apartheid. But in the book I use the expression apartheid of the present, because the conditions in which people live here in many ways haven't changed all that much, and the impacts on these populations continue. There's no easy solution, because about 10% of South Africa's GDP actually originates in this small area around the port of Durban. So of course it's a strategically important area for the government, and the government doesn't necessarily want to shut down any of those industries, or even necessarily put a lot of pressure on them to sort of clean up. So yes, this is different kind of fast violence, right? So both the Pashulok site and the Wentworth site in South Africa, they're different examples of how slow violence might accelerate, and how that might impact on the populations here. So how do you actually go into these places, and how do you study the kinds of imaginations and the kinds of impacts that living in such spaces might have on the young people here? So in the fieldwork, I relied a lot on methods borrowed from visual anthropology, visual ethnography. One of which was working with kids to produce these drawings that were trying to capture what they were imagining the future 100 years into the future would look like in their community, and what the past 100 years ago would look like, and then to sort of look at the two of them and see what were the similarities, what were the differences, in what ways were they maybe drawing on the past and imagining the future, or vice versa. What you're looking at here is a drawing of a 12-year-old boy in Wentworth in South Durban, and how this student, this pupil, is imagining the future of his community in 100 years' time. And I suppose it doesn't really need too much of a comment. Here's another one. Again, same age. Once again, doesn't need much of a comment. When you look at the pictures of the past, they do look very different. You know, I mean, there's a lot more. There are a lot more natural elements in these compositions. The human figures generally seem happier. There seems to be some kind of quote unquote harmony in these drawings. Here's another one. So, you know, if this was all I did, then what I would have concluded probably based on these drawings is that these kids essentially are doing what, you know, we as anthropologists are doing, which is romanticizing the past and despairing about the future. But thankfully, you know, ethnography does allow, you know, kind of extended immersion in a place and makes it easier to go deeper. And so I used another kind of method, which was which I have come to call slow participatory video making, and it's a spin on work that David McDougall in Australia has done, who's an ethnographic filmmaker, anthropologist, and you know he's done a lot of work around working with young people, with children. And getting them to make short films about their lives, about their experiences, about their environments. His sort of assumption is that it's not possible to kind of directly have a dialogue across generations, that we as adults are not going to be able to fully understand what young people might want to tell us. We may not be able to access their knowledge of the world directly through words and through dialogue. And therefore, we need a kind of bridge. We need another kind of medium to bridge that. And so he's sort of come up with this idea of filmmaking or video making to do that. And so I tried to adopt this in my own work. And basically, the way this works is that you go in with the equipment, you sort of spend a couple of months with the young people, sort of helping them become confident with the use of the equipment, but not at all thinking about the content of what they're going to do, simply just trying to help develop the kind of technical skills that they might need to do this. There's a particular work of this method, which is that ideally you don't use you know, an iPhone or a sort of easy to use camera. It's meant to be a camera that's deliberately difficult to use. So, you know, professional sort of equipment. And the reason for that is because it really forces the young people to slow down their gaze. So every time they press the record button, they have to make a series of technical decisions about focus, white balance, volume, whatnot, right? So they have to understand these concepts, and they have to really think about how am I framing the reality? You know, what is the shot that I want to capture? And it also serves the purpose of helping the ethnographer develop a relationship of trust with the young people, but without getting into the actual content of the film, right? So when you run these workshops as an ethnographer, you're not telling the students what they should be filming or what they should be focusing on. It's all about, you know, understanding white balance or understanding focus or understanding focal length. And so that creates a space to get to know one another, to kind of create some kind of a sense of community, but trying to kind of minimize the way that, you know, ways in which the ethnographer, in this case myself, would influence what the students might eventually end up producing in the films that they make. So what was really striking about the films that were made in both places to me was that the students sort of naturally gravitated towards the activist figures in the community. In the case, this is from one of the films that was made in India. You know, in this case, the students basically focused virtually the entire film on talking to older people in the community who were involved with the anti-dam struggle. So they were very curious to understand what was all this sort of about, right? But also they were asking questions and sort of eliciting conversations with older people about what life was like before the ancestral lands were flooded, and really trying to understand how that might be relevant for them. There really seemed to be a kind of search for identity. And I should also say, you know, this is not, in some ways, this is my interpretation and my analysis, but in other ways it isn't, because another thing that this method allows you to do is that once the film is made, you can then actually sit down with the young people who made it, and you can ask them questions about, you know, why they made this choice or that choice, and, you know, what did they intend here, and you know, why did they juxtapose this shot with this shot. And, you know, you are basically bringing them into the interpretation and the analysis. You're kind of allowing them an opportunity to give you their own reading of their own work. So then the analysis and the interpretation becomes also to some extent co-produced, which is by no means to say that there's no power hierarchy or that it erases the power hierarchy or takes the power away from the ethnographer. But I think, you know, it's an attempt at the very least, you know, to allow that voice of the young people to also influence how these films are then interpreted. And what was really interesting to me was that the films that were made in South Africa were very similar, actually. And this is Desmond Desa, who is one of the environmental activists in South Durban, in Wentworth, holding a device for measuring air quality, talking to the young people about what the activists are doing to try and sort of enforce the constitutionally guaranteed right to a clean environment, which is part of the South African Constitution. And so once again, there's this kind of natural draw and a kind of inclination of the students to these activist figures, almost using the film as a kind of excuse to get closer to them or to learn more about what they're doing. And I apologize, this is where it's going to get a little bit more academic and theoretical. But you know, this really kind of led to this question that I'm trying to address in this book, which is how activist counter-narratives of change might be shaping a reimagination of the future, right? So in other words, if we can't rely on these state-run systems, and there is this natural draw that the young people in these spaces of accelerating slow violence, you know, feel towards the activist in the community, then what kind of reimagination of the future becomes possible through that dialogue between the young people and the activists and the kind of engagement that they have. So in the book, I draw on the work of Chantal Mouffe, who's a French political scientist. And one of her contributions is this concept of agonistic pluralism, which she contrasts with the idea of deliberative democracy. So the idea is deliberative democracy is basically what we live in sort of Western liberal democracies. It's a system where we negotiate our difference through deliberation. So, you know, we have parliaments, we have all kinds of executive bodies, government bodies that are set up for us to negotiate our difference and arrive at some kind of common action. Mouffe argues that what tends to happen in such a system is that the kind of most quote-unquote marginal or quote-unquote extreme or radical views get excluded from the conversation, that you know, the systems within a deliberative democracy over time tends to have the effect of kind of sanitizing, kind of neutralizing the conversation. So an example of that would be if you were to look at the political programs of parties, just about any party in this country, but for that matter, just about any country, you will really struggle to find a party, for example, which is questioning the idea of infinite economic growth on a finite planet, right? You will not find that idea. So Mouffe would argue, well, that's because deliberative democracy has the effect of excluding such views from the dialogue, from the conversation. So we do end up having a conversation, and there are some tensions and disagreements, but they actually are quite minor, right? And there actually are lots of similarities, right? So if you looked at, you know, the Conservative Party and the Labour Party in this country, you would find that actually there are tons of similarities, right? If you're using this framework. She argues that what we need in this to kind of deal with this predicament is this idea of agonistic pluralism, which is a kind of way of engaging in democracy, which is more aligned with how we imagine, say, the ancient Greeks might have done it, right? Where you've got an agora, you've got a forum, people go to the forum and they argue it out, right? They don't shy away from tension, they don't shy away from disagreement. There's a kind of direct layer of engagement that doesn't necessarily go through that kind of sanitizing, mediating presence of the deliberative democratic model. It's different from, it's not anarchy and it's not direct democracy. Move argues that there's still a need for, rules of engagement. In agonistic pluralism, you don't see the person whom you disagree with as an enemy to be destroyed. You see them as an intellectual adversary, somebody whom you're trying to convince. And you both share a commitment to a kind of democratic setup. So the argument that I end up making in the book is that what these activist spaces are doing, and what you see to some extent manifesting in these films that the students made, is a kind of space of agonistic pluralism. It's a space where the kinds of things that might be unspeakable within the framework of, in this case, the Indian state or the South African state, it would be unspeakable to say that building a dam was a terrible idea. It would be unspeakable to say that the industries in South Durban that contribute 10% of South Africa's GDP should pick up and move. Right? These are things that are not allowed. They're beyond the pale within the deliberative democracy. But the activist spaces make these conversations possible. They create a space for that. So they become a kind of agonistic pluralistic space for debate, which is quite different from what you would find in the government schools, which are part of that deliberative democracy setup. I also link this to the work of Hannah Arendt, who is most famous for her work on the origins of totalitarianism. She was particularly interested in Stalinist Russian totalitarianism, 20th century Europe, so particularly interested in Nazism and Stalinism. What was it about those societies that enabled such unspeakable violence in the 20th century? And I sort of put forward this argument that in some ways the fast violence of the concentration camps and the gulags of the 20th century and the slow violence of the Anthropocene, that the roots of those might in some ways be parallel and similar. Arendt talks about the idea of bureaucratization, the idea that we become bureaucratized, meaning that we allow ourselves to turn into cogs in a machine, where we no longer question the kind of larger moral, ethical sort of goal or effect that the machine is having on the world. We are just sort of satisfied with being part of the machine and not questioning that larger frame. So, when I wake up in the morning, I don't sort of purposely decide to go out and destroy the planet. And yet by, participating in the system, just by, being alive, really, I am kind of an unwitting accomplice, right, in this slow violence and accelerating slow violence. In a similar way, I'm sure there were lots of people in Nazi Germany in the 1930s who didn't wake up in the morning and decide that they wanted to be contributing to a society that was sending people to gas chambers, right? So that theme of being an unwitting accomplice seems to be a recurring one, and there seems to be something about this idea of bureaucratization that applies to our current predicament. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because when you look at what Arendt has to say about what can we do about this, she talks about the idea of action as a kind of antidote to bureaucratization. Arendt makes a distinction between action and behavior. Behavior is something that is programmed, predictable, something that we are expected to do by virtue of the kind of cultural and political systems that we are engaged in. Whereas action is something that's unpredictable, original, novel, different. And again, in the book, I sort of end up making this argument that what these activists are doing in some ways is action, right? They're coming up with these kind of unpredictable ways of engaging with the world, whereas what the school is encouraging young people to do is to behave in a certain way, right? Certain kinds of behaviors. And so, you know, both on the agonistic pluralism front and on the action front, there's a clear distinction between the activists and the formal school systems. And also in Hannah Arendt's theory of action, agonistic pluralism is a kind of prerequisite to action, right? You need to engage. Action is never possible in isolation, right? That's what Arendt says. You need to engage in a certain kind of tension, productive tension with another person in order for action to become possible. And so I'm sort of really in not a very subtle way, I guess, saying that you know, these activist groups and movements that I was looking at are in many ways actually potentially a representation of the kind of thing that Chantal Mouffe and Hannah Arendt have been calling for. Okay, so I just want to spend the last bit of the talk on thinking about the implications of all of this and kind of bringing it back to earth and kind of practically, right? What can we do, and what does this tell us about how we can think about education differently? So I think the first point is, you know, if we can recognize that schooling and education are not the same. You know, in public conversations, we tend to equate those two things, but actually they're not the same. I would argue that the young people I worked with in India and in South Africa during this project are actually learning more in some ways about planetary predicament, not through school, but through informal spaces of learning. So there's a kind of education that's happening, but it's not schooling. If we do want to look at the formal systems and, you know, how we could change or reform those systems, I think a lot of the things that I learned from the activists and from the young people are telling me that the current direction of travel for certainly the UK, certainly the US, I'd say much of the Western world, in some ways is actually in the opposite direction from what would be helpful for the planetary predicament, right? We have a strong trend of neoliberal globalization in education, where curricula are merging. So when you look at the textbooks that are being used in the classroom in Pashulok and the textbooks that are being used in the classroom in Wentworth in South Africa, they're actually very similar. You will not find anything about Tehri Dam in the textbook in India, and you will not find anything about the racialized history of South Durban in the textbook in South Africa. So, you know, so I think we're very much running away from the localization of curricula and engaging with the local, which again is something that the activists do. Then there is this question of bureaucratization and debureaucratization, and again, we are, I would argue, currently witnessing a trend where teachers are not really seen as educators. They're more sort of just there to, you know, to kind of make sure that the kids are in the classroom and, you know, and they are using the tablet or whatever it is that they're, you know, but actually, you know, in an education system that would be emphasizing debureaucratization, you would expect to see teachers being given lots of agency, you know, being trusted to make choices, to model certain ways of being, to create spaces for things like agonistic pluralism. There's very, very little space for any of that currently. And that's also partly due to quantification, right? I mean, we are trying to quantify everything in education. You cannot quantify agonistic pluralism. You cannot quantify radical imagination of the future, right? I mean, those are not quantifiable concepts. Another kind of implication / finding is that what I picked up on quite strongly when I did this field work was a high degree of distrust between the educators and the activists, right? So the activists would tell you, teachers, you know, they're part of the problem. They're working for the state, with the state. And then the teachers would tell you, well, the activists, you know, they're far too radical, that we don't want to engage with them. We don't want to talk to them. We don't want to bring them to school because, you know, they're problematic. So I think there's something to be said for removing barriers between educators and activists, but also maybe for encouraging kind of hybrid identities. I have also come across, and if you do get a chance to look at the book, you'll find there's a section called Outlier Teachers, where I look at this phenomenon of what I call activist educators and educational activists, people who actually do kind of have a foot in both worlds, and they do exist. So I think as I spend more time on this project, I also realized that some of my own assumptions about activists and teachers being separate categories, sort of got problematized as a result of the fieldwork that I did. So what does educating for the Anthropocene mean then? Well, it means recognizing that we live in the Anthropocene, recognizing the implications of that, thinking with and through deep time, thinking about planetary boundaries, stewardship of the planet, a more radical definition of sustainability, political imagination, action, all of the things I talked about earlier. And I just want to sort of end by contrasting these thoughts with this model of 21st century learning, which is a fairly influential idea in education. You will probably find on lots of institutions, I would imagine UCL's website as well, you would find if you look at the sort of mission statements and so on, you will probably find 21st century learning mentioned somewhere, right? The idea that we are preparing people for life in the 21st century, and then there's something different about the 21st century from the 20th or the 19th. That's what we are responding to, and that's our job as educators. So if you replace the 21st century by the Anthropocene, and that forces you to confront the sort of deep time, then I think it becomes very clear just how arbitrary this idea of the 21st century is, right? I mean, I think the difference between the 20th and the 21st century really pales in comparison to the difference between the Holocene and the Anthropocene. But besides that issue, I think it's also important to sort of problematize this, right? Because the kinds of education that I describe in the chapters of the book that talk about schooling, where I've gone into classrooms and I looked at what is actually happening in these spaces, are done in the name of 21st century learning. And when you look at these words, I mean, on the face of it, they look good, right? They make sense. Critical thinking, metacognition, creativity. How can you disagree with that, right? But actually, what I end up kind of arguing in the book is that these concepts, however well meant or well-meaning, the people who put these in place were, maybe initially, they have sort of become captured by corporate interests, I suppose. I mean, essentially, the goal of this is to create a graduate, create a worker who is going to be employable, right? So you want people to be thinking critically, in the sense that you want them to be able to solve problems that they might encounter in the jobs, in the occupations they go into. But you don't want them to think too critically. You don't want them to think so critically that they would start questioning something like the wisdom of infinite growth on a finite planet, right? So there's a kind of limit and a kind of capture, and you could say almost a kind of double speak, to some of these things. And so that's why what I try to write. So obviously, as you can tell, I'm against this, in case that wasn't clear. And so so what I try to sort of suggest is, as you saw in the animation, is this model of grasp, care, imagine, communicate, right? And really, doing that in a way that allows for that kind of friction, as I was saying earlier, Hannah Arendt's insight, right? That action is never possible in isolation. Action is only possible when you've got different people who come together. The idea of grasping what is at stake, care as the emotional response, which again is very sort of countercultural. We don't tend to think much of emotions in the way that we design education systems. It's all about cognition and rationality and knowledge and facts. But actually, we know from research in psychology that care is critical to any kind of meaningful long-term change in how people engage with the environment. if you don't care, if you don't have an emotional stake in what you're doing, then it's going to be very superficial. And yet somehow we don't think about emotions when it comes to education. The idea of imagination, right? Being able to imagine alternative futures, which I would personally argue is something that we are born with. I think, if you talk to kids, you will find that they do that kind of instinctively, but it's not something that our education systems encourage. And then, of course, the ability to communicate that vision to other people, and through that to arrive at some kind of action. And what I should also point out is that this is meant to be a kind of dynamic, iterative process. So once I have communicated with somebody else, I might realize that perhaps there was something I didn't grasp fully, which makes me care differently or makes me care about something else and alters my imagination. So this is a kind of ongoing dynamic process, and it's also meant to be a kind of model or set of ideas which are really not revolutionary, really not all that different from ideas about learning and education that have been around for hundreds of years, right? You go back to the ancient Greeks and the wisdom of know thyself, right? In a way, that's all this is, right? Grasping, caring, imagination, communication. These are things that are innate to us as humans. This is not any kind of artificial construct that is being imposed on people. When a baby is born, one of the first instincts is to grasp, right? Caring, imagination, communication come soon after. So it's all about simply just harnessing what's already in us. I mean, what you might call humanistic education, which, yeah, to me, just based on this work and having spent 6 or 7 years working on this, and then 6 or 7 years on the previous book, which kind of led to this, that's the conclusion that I come away with, and that's what I want to share with you and leave you with. And do feel free to disagree or critique, or I look forward to questions. Thank you.
And just a minute, Robin, I'll just set this up so we've got our friends from Zoom.
That's why we have to go up to the
Well, we need to mic check. We've got some, let's see, we need to mic check.
You're wandering around with that little speaker.
Yeah, if you can help, and you need to move it to, where it is, and we can ask for it. Not mute. That's where we've got. Yeah, we want it to be able to speak, and just so that Zoom people can hear. Peter, do you want to come in the box so people can see you? I'm just going to help you. So, right. Anybody on Zoom wants to ask questions, put your hands up, please. Oh.
Well, yes, thank you for that. It was it's interesting to see what people have been able to do working with communities that are under the heel of more extreme, more destructive forms of oppression than we experience, as you've said, in London. And I would like to go back to the point you made, as it were, in passing. You talked about how in today's world or particular stressed communities are faced with slow violence, and you contrasted this briefly with the faster violence of particular periods in the past, and this certainly makes sense. But I think to bring this down to a single point, where does this violence come from? And it's the word that I was waiting to hear from you, which didn't come up, and that's capitalism. And it's capitalism that gives us this violence. Capitalism is based on violence. It was brought into the world through violence. It can only continue existing from day to day through the continuous exercise of violence. And until we take on capitalism as such, and not this or that minor manifestation, epiphenomenal manifestation of capitalism, then there will be violence, both slow and fast, for everyone. And at the end of your talk, you said these ideas are not revolutionary, and I'm afraid that's so. I mean, first of all, tinkering with education systems. you didn't mention where the reason education systems can exist is because there are capitalist states that finance them. And so the whole question of state finance and who the state chooses to employ as teachers comes into it. And I've seen this in education and in many other areas of life over the last 50 years, how people come up with well nice humanistic notions of what we can do to improve the situation. And the moment that somebody in state authority thinks it's either a dangerous challenge or just irrelevant to the state's needs, it would just get swept away. Until you dealt with the underlying issues of this society, these things are just marginalia. And you know, and at the end, I was horrified that you should have relied on all people of Hannah Arendt. I mean, Hannah Arendt takes her philosophy, including her political philosophy, off the shelf from her lover, Heidegger, who had certainly had a conception of the organic structure of society, but not the kind of organic society we'd like to live in. So I think, you know, this whole notion, we won't get a proper education for the Anthropocene, or better still, an education for humanity until we've got rid of the capitalist system. And so ideas like this, I'm sorry, but I'm afraid they are very much putting the cart before the horse.
Okay, all right. Okay. Okay, right, quite a few things in there. Okay, so I mean, I'm not, you know, I'm not gonna defend Heidegger for sure. But I would say, you know, that Hannah Arendt made some valuable contributions, and I tend to look at, you know, the quality of the individual ideas. They're not, you know, not everything that she wrote I would agree with necessarily, but you know, bureaucratization to me makes a lot of sense. And so I'm not going to discredit that just because of her personal relationships or because of her sort of life story. But on the larger point on capitalism, you know, I have had versions of this question before, and it is something I think about a lot. I think part of the problem with structuring the question around kind of abolishing capitalism is that, yeah, I mean, like on some level, I agree with you that that's what we ultimately that's what we need to do. But at the same time, pragmatically, right? I mean, there's radical change and there is incremental change, and I think for a long time, right, there have been efforts to come up, you know, to deal with this problem through radical change. And I mean, as you can tell by my accent, I'm not from around here. I was born in what was then Czechoslovakia, and being, you know, quite familiar with the history of the way that people tried to abolish capitalism in a radical way in that part of the world, right, sort of just gives me some pause when I think about whether that's the way to go. And that's why I tend to think about, you know, incremental change as well as an alternative way of trying to do this. Now, when you come out and you say capitalism is the problem, in my experience, what that tends to do is you'll end up with people who agree with you, and they tend to be people who agreed with you before you said it. And then the people who don't agree with you, they're not going to be convinced by it, right? And that's partly because I think people actually misunderstand, you know, what capitalism is. And I really liked, you know, Jason Hickel's new book, Less is More, you know, where he really very clearly makes a distinction between, you know, markets as something that human societies and economic structures have had for thousands of years, and capitalism as a particular system of accumulation. And so but I think the problem is that the two really get confused in public discourse. And so when you say capitalism is the problem, people tend to think, oh, okay, so, you know, you're talking about totalitarianism, you're talking about taking away our freedom, you're talking about, you know, taking away, like cracking down on our ability to trade freely or exchange freely or talk freely. And so it then descends into kind of culture war, which I just think is not very productive. And that's why I choose not to frame it in that way, but I fully respect your choice to frame it that way. Yeah. Okay.
Any follow-up? Not necessarily from Robin, anybody else? Chris, did you want to say something? go for the, oh, no, Vicky, go for it.
This.
Oh, sorry, Liz, oh, sorry, getting, so sorry.
I'm not an anthropologist, and maybe my views are coming from a more simplistic way, but capitalism is at the crux of it, because, like, for example, in your South African study, if you've got a relatively big group of people who are benefiting from capitalism, so they can take their kids to the doctors and they've got the wherewithal to pay for it, they're not going to want to get rid of that. But there's nothing that's being there's not an alternative. So you're not going to get those people who are going to be radical and do anything about it, because they've got a lot to lose. So until something is given that's an alternative, and that's an alternative to capitalism. So capitalism is the crux of it. And also the Anthropocene, surely it would have been better to focus on, did you say at the beginning, capitalism? Yeah, that would have maybe been a better direction to go, because capitalism is the crux of all the problems. So, but that's coming from, I'm not an anthropologist.
Yeah.
It's coming from
No,
a very simplistic.
That's a perfectly valid,
point of view.
yeah, it's a perfectly valid, I mean, again, I would just come back saying, look, what's our theory of change here, right? How are we actually, if our objective is to get rid of capitalism, how do we get rid of capitalism, right? Do we get rid of capitalism by saying that, we have to, implement educating for the capitalist scene, which is already kind of on the label, even before you know anything else about it, is going to be incredibly off-putting to a whole lot of people. And in a place like Wentworth in South Africa, you will hear a lot of people say, well, look, this sucks. It sucks that we are getting sick. However, if these factories were not here, if they moved, we'd have no jobs and we would starve, right? And so I think again there's a kind of tension there between the kind of ideal utopia and what's in the short run possible, right? Because I fear that if we say, okay, let's just abolish capitalism and let's not care about the consequences, then in the short run, what's going to happen to those people? Are we going to let them starve, right? But by the time that the systems have adjusted and changed and made it possible for them to make a living in a different way. So there's a kind of pragmatic question here. Yeah.
Chris, do you want? Anybody on Zoom? Chris is going to have a question. Then anyone on Zoom would like to?
As you were speaking, I kept on agreeing with you, and especially interested in what you say you learned from the activists in the two places where you did your field work. And then of course you then kind of within that framework you set up, you put your own view, I think, which is this need for agonistic pluralism, which I think I can sort of understand. But I suppose the critical point you're making all the way through, which again is a very good one, is that we need radical imagination, and that's something which again you got from your activist friends that you work with. I suppose I've got a very simple question. What is your imagined alternative future?
Okay. I have not been asked that. Interestingly.
Interesting.
Yeah. Look, I mean, I'm one of the people who are behind the new degrowth journal that just published its first issue. So I subscribe to degrowth. I believe that it's a good way to think about the problem. you know, and everything that entails. And I think, you know, again, it's a range, you know, within degrowth, there could be a kind of very utopian perspective. And I would take that perspective, but I would probably say, you know, that you probably do need to allow, you know, a good chunk of time before you can get there. So I suppose, you know, the answer to your question depends on the future, when 10 years from now, 100 years from now, 1,000 years, you know, because I do think that if we say, like I was, you know, saying to the earlier question, if we say, okay, we want to have this degrowth world and we want to have it tomorrow without thinking about what that is going, the kind of dislocation that it is going to do, then aren't we kind of doing the same thing that the people who built that dam are doing, right? We can say, well, you know, we want to create a certain kind of world. We don't care. We're just going to shut these people aside because we want it quickly and we want it tomorrow. So I would say that, you know, ultimately I would, you know, imagine a future where we don't measure progress, you know, by economic output. We don't attach, you know, more value to a dead tree than to a living tree. We don't, you know, emphasize materialistic, you know, consumption and status symbols through our education. You know, we have a culture that attaches value, you know, to different kinds of things, you know, that values things like care, for example. So yeah, that's the kind of world that ultimately I would like to see. And just, it's a slight tangent, but I think it kind of speaks to all of these questions. One of the things that I do say in the book, which, you know, has been somewhat controversial, which I forgot to say, is that actually I do in the conclusion kind of come out saying, look, maybe it's not actually realistic to reform education systems, to change education systems by incorporating these ideas from activists, because there is a history of people trying to do that, you know, where you take ideas from the margins and you try to mainstream them. And of course, then those ideas end up losing their teeth. And they get, like with the 21st century skills, you know, it just becomes this double speak for something totally different. And that actually maybe there is part of the answer to this is this idea of educating for the Anthropocene or capitalocene or whatever we call it, is, you know, recognizing that yeah, actually people learn outside of schools and that we just need to create space for that. And so maybe in practical sort of policy terms, it means, look, you know, we just actually ask kids to be spending less time in schools. We create more space and more opportunity for them to be doing things outside of schools. Maybe we recognize that some of these non-school, non-formal education groups, and that's not just activists. I mean, that could be religious groups, that could be all kinds of, you know, I mean, there are people doing parallel research, you know, on sort of spirituality and environment and learning. You know, maybe we allow possibilities for redirecting some of the funding that currently goes into education systems to go to these spaces. So you know, something along the lines of you know, somewhere between radical and change. Yeah.
I'm sorry. Oh, you finished.
I'm finished.
You're happy there.
Yeah.
And Arif, I think you should go next, and then we'll come back to the okay?
Cheers. Thanks, Camilla. Yeah, firstly, I have to apologize, Peter. I only saw the last sort of 15, 20 minutes of the talk. I arrived a bit late. So apologies if you've sort of covered this previously, but I am interested in really the limitations of the concept of the Anthropocene, particularly the fact that it sort of erases human diversity. And it actually, you're talking about, you know, alternatives. It actually erases the alternatives that actually exist. There's 2.5 billion people on the planet in indigenous and local communities who aren't part of the Anthropocene in the sense that they're contributing to global emissions, etc. And yeah, I also worry it's also a hugely sort of colonial. It comes from, you know, Western science, so it's a colonial concept, and I worry about applying this to the global South. As I say, I didn't see how you applied it, so I can't comment on the specifics. And also, just a second question, a sort of maybe a bit controversial one, following up from the criticism around capitalism. I wonder if also a reason why you and perhaps other sort of anti-capitalist researchers can't talk about capitalism is because you have to deal with neoliberal sort of universities and you have to get funding through them. So is that perhaps another reason why you have to tone down your language and unfortunately, you know, come up with something that's not quite as radical as a lot of us would like?
Okay,
Thanks.
thanks for that. Yeah. So on the first question, you know, I talked about it a little bit in the beginning, and yes, you know, I totally acknowledge and agree with that criticism about diversity and homogenization, and also, you know, the colonial and the colonial origins of it. I mean, you know, Catherine Youssef's book, you know, Billion Black Anthropocenes or None, is a great sort of expose of the colonial history and colonial sort of nature of geology as a science, actually. But yeah, I guess just to go back to what I was, you know, what I said kind of in the beginning is that I think it's a question of emphasis, right? We could be placing emphasis on where this came from, and you know, who is responsible, and those are very important questions. But again, if I'm thinking about you know, kind of, again, you know, we go back to that question of radical versus incremental change. If I accept that we live in a world where there is an education system, and that it's not going to go away tomorrow, no matter what I do, it's not going to go, you know, so if I want to find a way to influence it, right, I want to find a way to influence it and influence the, you know, the people within it. And I don't think that the people within it are entirely homogeneous and that they all fully buy into capitalism, or, you know, that they're all equally kind of on the same wavelength, right? I mean, that there's that section in the book, again, about sort of activist educators and educational activists. I do think there's a range. And so if I want to reach the people who might be open to this argument, they're going to be, I think, in my experience, more interested in, you know, a forward-looking idea of like, okay, so what is the predicament? What is the historical moment? And that's, I think, where the Anthropocene can do some work, right? Because it you can say, you know, this affects everybody, right? In different ways, but you know, we are not equally responsible for it, and we are not equally affected. But all of us, in one way or another, are going to be affected. And therefore, if we are going to have an education system, which in itself is a kind of universalism, and you could argue is a colonial construction, but again, it's not going away tomorrow. So if we're going to have that, then we can try to create some kind of incremental change by applying another universalism to that universalism, right? So the universalism of education and the universalism of the Anthropocene, I think, can create a kind of bridge in conversations about this and the role of education. And to the second question, you know, I mean, I think, you know, you are getting at something important there, and it certainly is true that, you know, the funding landscape, you know, is pretty dreary for sure in this country when it comes to doing research and doing work that goes against, you know, government priorities or government policies or certain kinds of unquestioned truths, you know. I mean, I like to think that those of us who do ethnography, you know, which is a pretty low cost research method, right? Who don't need to rely on massive grants and who don't need to kind of beg the research councils for money, that you know, we do actually have a degree of freedom. I certainly don't feel that by openly coming out, you know, against capitalism, I would be putting my job at risk, or, you know, or that I wouldn't be able to do what I do. I think there probably are people who feel that way, you know, the ones who really depend on sort of large grants from the government, and that could be true. And for me, like I was saying, you know, it's partly to do with you know, growing up in a totalitarian socialist and then post-socialist country, and having seen the history of that place, and how an attempt to radically overthrow capitalism went south in a pretty horrible way. That's where I think my hesitancy comes from when it comes to thinking about radical versus incremental change and capitalism. Yeah.
And Lieta, you wanted to intervene. Then I'd like to have a little go.
Yes. Thank you for, a lot of things, and I was kind of on Robin's camp in a lot of different ways, but I'm thinking, okay, let's think change. Let's not think what's wrong. Let's think what we can do, which is really what we do in RAG. We create an alternative space. But again, this is a very privileged space. It's a privileged space for people like us that can spend the train money to come to move for everyone's well, or people who have internet access, who have, the privilege of having a computer, Zoom, and the time to be in that alternative space. Yeah, these are all very, very privileged alternative spaces, not spaces for the people that need it most. Alternative spaces, I don't know, after school clubs and things like this. Which mother has got now the money, the time, there's the capitalist system, whether we like it or not, doesn't allow for care, doesn't allow for grandparents to retire to help with childcare. So how do people access these alternative spaces? What can we do? Other than, not only incremental change, but literally individual tiny little changes, which of course all amount up to a lot. But, when it comes to systemic changes, whether we do it incrementally or not, which government is going to make the decision to allow for these alternative spaces? One, because they don't want them, because they don't want people to think. I mean, I come from an art background, or definitely even before, a humanities background. All these spaces are being shut, or the art degrees are being shut. The alternative spaces are utterly degrees. It shouldn't have never been degrees anyway, because that's in itself a bureaucratization and a quantification of something, because you've got to be an employable, productive member of society that you should have a degree in doctrine. It's like preposterous. But this is kind of, incremental, yes, but systemic, and which government is going to make a decision, and I thought somebody put in the chat earlier, I could kind of not read it properly, about the agency of teachers. What agency of teachers?
Lily, yeah.
I know of teachers in Italy, and certainly from colleagues in America that are constantly being, threatened with fines, with suspension, or even in their own tiny little classroom space, slightly diverging from what is the canon, the imposed canon. So okay, on a positive, thing, what do we do? Because at some point it is, Chris' favorite word is revolution time. Other than creating sort of a revolutionary kind of movement, where everybody thinks like, you're coming and preaching to the converted.
Yeah. I agree with you. I mean, for me, that question sort of goes back to, again, what's the theory of change here, right? Like, how does one kind of break that vicious circle? And I mean, in what you were saying, there was a kind of assumption that, that it's the government who has to be the first actor, right? That, the government has to do something, and so it has to come from the top. I mean, I like to think, it sort of goes back to that, age-old sociological tension, between structure and agency, right? I mean, do we have any agency within the structure we're part of? I like to think that we do, and that I mean, a lot of these trends. I'm now like thinking particularly about India, which is a country that I've been working in for a long time, and I have actually seen the education system change and evolve, not in a direction that I would personally like. I mean, it's gone more in the kind of neoliberal efficiency kind of, right? But when I look at, why did that happen, right? Sure, the government had something to do with it. Sure, the corporation had something to do with it. But I also think there is a certain culture, particularly among middle class people in that country, a certain set of expectations and what people want for their kids. You know, the kind of education they want their kids to have, the kind of careers they want their kids to have, the kind of lives they want their kids to have, which I think has changed. And I think that is a cultural change, which then puts pressure from the bottom up to accelerate some of these trends. And I could easily imagine a world where it would put pressure in the opposite direction, right? You know, if you go with this, you know, this idea of kind of neoliberal, you know, consumer choice and whatnot, and that, you know, I as a parent, for example, can vote by where I send my kid to school, and that if I have the option of sending my kid to an alternative school which does things very differently, and you know, and I'm not primarily motivated by you know, whether my kid is going to get a job at Microsoft or whatever, then you know, I'm making a choice. And if a critical mass of people make that choice, that's culture change, right?
It's not that choice. I mean, I'm looking at Britain and Italy. I'm an Italian immigrant. I've been here 30 years. In Italy, we've had 50 years of school reforms that have gone from worse to worse to worse to worse. Where, you know, nobody's got agency. The parents haven't got agency. You know, the teachers haven't got agency. The teachers' heads haven't got agency. Nobody's got agency to make choices. Then I come here and I see now I've had people, you know, and we've got Gramsci that have been writing about this, and it's for like, but what's right, for 100 years ago or more. And here, when I've had, you know, I've dealt with kids that go to, you know, Steiner school and stuff like that. Great. Who can send their kids to Steiner school? Who's got the time to choose the schools? You know, people are struggling to even get their kids into their local school where they don't have, you know, where you know, if their kids haven't got the money to, you know, to go on the bus or anything. So it's like, it's kind of, I think it's a little bit deeper than the utopian thing that we're thinking about. There's so much else that needs to be patched up on the side that has to do with capitalism. You know, who's got that great choice to send their kids to, you know, on an incredibly low income on doing jobs?
Well, not everybody is on incredibly low incomes. I mean, there are people who are not on low incomes and who still, again, when you're talking about culture change, I think, you know, it is about numbers of people, but also, you know, people who have a certain cultural and social capital and who are able to influence, you know, the kinds of collective assumptions that we make as a society. And my answer would be, sure, not everybody does, and maybe not a lot of people have that choice, but I think more people have that choice than maybe they think they do, and more people could be making that choice that currently are not. And that, to me, would be one mechanism through which you can at least, you know, do something.
Okay, thanks for contributions. So Ian is going to go, and then Ronit following Ian. Okay, if you unmute, thanks, Ronit.
First of all, I'd like to say I really warmed to your talk. I really enjoy it. But I think there was an opening line that rubbed me up the wrong way. Disregard for nature. That this was the problem. I think you can, and it's, in a sense, it's coming back to what. If we see it in terms of development of class societies and capitalism, then fundamental issues is disregard, well, historically, the disregard for people. You know, the capitalists have never had a disregard for nature. They've just seen it as another thing that they own. That is what they do in Wentworth or in the Dam. You know, that is just their ownership of the world. Related to that, imagination. It's not so much that we need a theory of change. It's that we've had 2 generations now who have no experience of winning anything. So we don't have any practice of change. And until that shifts, we are condemned to imagine that it's easier to imagine the end of life this world than it is to imagine a different world, a different way of thinking.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. I agree with you on both points. And I guess the only thing I would say, I mean, yeah, point taken on the disregard for nature. I suppose it partly depends on, how we define nature. And I tend to think of, people as part of nature. So, disregard for nature implies disregard for people. I don't see it as a kind of dualistic kind of two separate things necessarily. But yeah, on the second point, yeah, I think that is, you're getting at something very important, which is that, yeah, if you don't have a living memory of actually, successfully challenging the status quo, then that's a problem. I think, again, partly because of where I come from and identifying, with South Africa and having worked there, I think there is maybe a more recent, right, like the sort of 1989 moment in Eastern Europe and the 1993 moment in South Africa, the election of Mandela and so on. You've got some living memory of some changes, and it has been very interesting, for me to, for example, see. I mean, the guy you saw in one of the photos, Desmond Desau, the environmental activist in Wentworth, he used to be an anti-apartheid fighter, and when apartheid ended, he then became an environmental activist. So, and there are quite a few people who follow that trajectory. So you've got an environmental movement, which is kind of fueled by that memory of, I don't know if you would call it successful. I mean, they would argue that it hasn't been as successful as they would like it to be in terms of the democratic transition, but certainly some victories. And yeah, and I wonder, if there's a way that those of us in a place like this, can tap into that experience, if we haven't had it ourselves, right? Is there something we can learn? Some way we can keep it alive by looking at other countries, other parts of the world. Yeah.
Thanks. I've got Ronit online.
Yeah.
Ronit.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the talk as well, Peter. I just had a quick question touching on the question a few moments ago, which is that knowledge is, we can't decontextualize knowledge from the social, cultural and political axes from which they're created. And so in that sense, even these alternate spaces, even RAG to a degree, for example, are always in some way linked to capitalism, because for something to be alternate, they have to deviate from some sort of thing to begin with. So my question following that would be, is it possible to have a truly radical imagination, or will we always be imagining an alternative to capitalism rather than something in and of itself? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I have to be a little bit careful here because I don't want to go sort of overboard in my answer, but in my personal experience, working with children, and I have worked with children of sort of various ages, and you really do see that, and that's what I meant when I said that I think that we are born with the capacity for radical imagination. You do see in the younger children who have spent less time in that education system, I think you see more of a tendency, more of a propensity to not just be imagining alternatives to whatever is around, because they haven't fully internalized that yet, potentially, and therefore really kind of giving their imagination a kind of free rein. I have certainly seen that happen, and I have also seen how, as you go further up the chain and you get into secondary school and so on, that propensity, perhaps that capacity, diminishes. Just recently I was having a conversation with somebody who runs an environmental studies program in one of the American universities, who was basically telling me, look, in our program, essentially we think of the entire first year of what we do with our undergraduates as deschooling, right? That we try to kind of get them out of all the brainwashing that went into their primary, secondary educations, and to kind of get them back kind of to square one. So I get a sense that there is a certain kind of recognition that, that there is, but again, I want to be careful not to overstate it, right? Because there is also the kind of romanticization of childhood, and and sort of making it seem like we should sort of make it kids' jobs to save us, right? So that's not what I meant. That's not what I mean to say. But I do think that capacity is there, And I do think that there are ways to revisit it. And I mean, you know, I would love to see some psychological research on that, for instance, but very few people are working on it. So yeah.
On that,
So I really liked the kind of model of education and how it was almost broken down into curriculum content as well as the process. Could I explain how I kind of understood it?
Sure.
So in the graph section, this is kind of them understanding all the complex interconnected crises from all over the world, all the different issues, how they're interconnected. Then at the care stage, this is understanding themselves, their emotions, maybe their group dynamics, maybe the connections to the natural world, or something like that. And then after care, we go into the dreaming. So that's the radical imagination, thinking of different futures, and then into the communication, vision, and then action. And so I think that the action, and then getting a group of students together to imagine a future, even just for their school, their community, and then doing that action and having an experience of successfully collaborating together on a project as small as like growing vegetables or something, can be, I think, what you're referring to, like these small successes, these small wins, that then they can then go around the cycle again, maybe go deeper into some of these different crises, deeper into their connection to self, to each other, to the environment, their community, and then try maybe a slightly bigger project, a bigger action. And I don't know, when I was seeing this, I just thought it was, a really nice, powerful kind of model and system of how we could build up the competencies and capacity of young people to maybe eventually make bigger and bigger actions that could potentially even be in the nation level, country level.
No, I appreciate that interpretation. I guess one caveat that I would say, this is from an earlier piece of research, which is not really in this book, it was another paper I wrote a while ago. I was looking at something called the handprint, which was an approach to environmental education that was quite popular some time back. Which was, the idea was, that we don't want to be talking to kids about the footprint because that's depressing, and then they just go into climate anxiety, and then it just sort of messes up their mental health. So let's focus on the handprint. The handprint is the thing that you can do with your hands, the actions, the things that you can do. And then I went around and I looked at a bunch of schools that were implementing this approach, which again, like on paper sounded great, but what I discovered was that it was implemented in a very particular way. And so something like growing veggies or fixing the leaking tap in the bathroom, or switching off the light when you leave the room, that's handprint. You're using your hands to do something. But then writing a letter to an elected representative, or writing a placard and taking that on a march or a demonstration or a protest, that's not handprint, because you're not directly addressing the issue yourself. You're asking somebody else to do it. So there was a kind of individualization of responsibility and a kind of depoliticization. So I think you could really see how there were these pre-existing patterns of individualization and depoliticization that exist in the school system. The handprint, the notion comes in, and it becomes kind of captured, right? And it becomes, again, almost like double speak, right? That it's like we're teaching kids that they can only affect their kind of immediate surroundings, immediate microcosms, and there's no point coming together and realizing the kind of political dimension of yourself. So I think what you're saying is right, but I suppose that it's not an automatic. It's, when you keep moving on the circles, it doesn't. You can get also stuck, right? And so I think there is a danger that you don't actually kind of go to those more sophisticated, larger scale, larger level actions, but you just get stuck, and you get told that I'm just a cog in a machine, and then it becomes a kind of bureaucratization. So I suppose it sort of depends on how you do it, and and what kinds of actions you encourage, and what you define to be as sort of acceptable or desirable in terms of the outcomes of that process. So I guess there are a few more variables to think about.
thanks. And Dasha, do you want to put in? I think you're one of the last questions. I'd like to say a little bit as well, but Dasha, go.
Thank you, Peter. I think your work could benefit by what's happening in the global south. Arturo Escobar has written about this for some time, and he has maybe been the instigator, but others too, of possibility studies, a new field of study. And they are really rooted in the indigenous ways of peoples, of honoring the pluriverse, they call it, the multiple ways of being, rather than the capitalist, modernist approach to making everybody the same and treating everyone the same. So I think there are so much wealth of knowledge, such a great wealth of knowledge around the world among indigenous peoples. 80% of the biodiversity is saved or under their direction in 20% of the land that they control. And it's the elders in those societies that have this vast knowledge and know so much and have so much to teach. And, you know, the modernist culture ignores elders, right? Because you love the youth. So we have to kind of reverse our understanding. And I think we have to get back to localization, which in that pluriverse, a variety of ways of being, because every landscape on Earth requires a different kind of tender care. You know, a desert landscape versus a plains or a bog landscape. And the indigenous peoples know how, at least traditionally, knew how to live well in those places. And I think more of that is needed. We can't just, you know, put it on the young to, as you said, to come up with things, you know, with their imagination. The elders have the vaster imagination, and of course the young children too, which I study. So anyway, so I would advocate for including the global south, the indigenous perspectives, and all the wealth of wisdom already in existence. So we don't have to think ourselves how to do it, because they're there and they're doing it. And I'm doing right now, and where I live, we're doing no mow may, right, to help the pollinators exist, the bees and the wasps and the flies, because we are destroying the insect populations on the planet. And so we each can do our part wherever we are. And I think we have to get back, put our hands in the earth, as you're suggested, and do our thing wherever we are now. Thanks.
Yep. No, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I agree with everything you said. I suppose, you know, the only comment I would make is that obviously there is that tension again between the kind of universalism and the particularisms, right? So the indigenous ways of being, of knowing, of learning, of engaging, they are localized, and you know, I think that there's been a sort of a fair amount of including in education, you know, there's been some interesting work done on, you know, can you actually take some of that and can you mainstream it, or can you sort of, you know, transfer it to another place, you know, and to what extent can you sort of do that without the contextual, cultural, you know, political, social factors. So I think, you know, what you're saying is right. Yeah, I guess it's also then a question of how we do it, and, you know, how do we pay attention to the context of each locality.
So yeah, so part of it is honoring the natural world around you. So every one of us can do that. So we can do it in our local space. So we can learn, we have to relearn how to do that, right? So that's the universalist approach, is to honor nature here and now. Yeah,
I would agree with that.
I'm going to jump into it. I don't know if there's anybody else, but I just jump into, I like Ian, I've warmed a great deal to Peter's fresh perspectives. You know, she's had a lot of comeback here, which has, you know, maybe some people think it's too, you know, it's ignoring some of the large parts of the problem. But I think there's ways in which he's going to very powerful, this model, as you said, very, very powerful aspects of human nature that, as Dasha's talking about, we need to tap into things that are really part of the grain of human nature to effect change. And in particular, when we're thinking of the geological time frame of Anthropocene, or we can consider against that the geological time frame of evolution. And there is a lot now going on in evolution, in psychology, developmental psychology literature applied to evolution on who actually does teaching and learning. And what they're coming to is that actually children teach children. And that is the big motor of change, probably was the big motor of change through many parts of human evolution. So that, you know, this is saying something that would be talking to a lot of what Peter's model is saying here. And then we need to consider marrying that with global aspect, universal aspects of what are our evolved psychologies of human nature, coming out of Sarah Hrdy's cooperative childcare models and intersubjectivity models and all of that, marrying that with the local. We were watching, I mean, it was fascinating to watch Peter's photos of the kids taking their films and then going straight away to those elders that Darsha's talking about, to the people that they know about the local ecologies and the local histories. And that is what evolutionary development psychology is saying, is that circuit was highly operative, grandmothering, grandparenting with peer learning of the young children as a driving force of human cultural transmission and cultural accumulation and kind of creation of human culture. I think it really is for us to say thank you to Peter. This has been one of the most thought-provoking talks and brought out so many thoughtful questions and everything. It's been a great final talk of it's not a final talk, let me just say that. It's not a final talk, it's the final live talk here. So we've really been able to enjoy that. Thank you to everybody on Zoom for joining. Thank you to everybody for coming. We are going on next week on Zoom. Please don't miss it, because we've got actually a fantastic talk addressing questions of education and Anthropocene from the indigenous scholar Olga Ultorgasheva, who has Siberian Eveni Lamut heritage. She's done very much a lot of work in terms of children education. They're facing the future. She's going to be telling us about reading reindeer shoulder blade, the environment, engaging with the environmental uncertainty in Northeast Siberia. And I expect that to be a fantastic talk. So if you already know the Zoom ID, it's going to be the same next week, so come again. Otherwise, just sign up on Eventbrite to get the relevant information. I hope we'll be seeing plenty of people coming back next week. So I'm just going to say goodbye to everybody on Zoom and thank you for questions and participation. And then I'll say goodbye to everybody here. So thanks to Peter, and I think everybody's. Thank you. And everyone here is involved.